Get off the line, Sergeant. That is a direct order. General Kalen Sterling's voice cracked, a sound rarely heard from a man who had weathered 3 decades of warmong. The Joint Operations Center was suffocating, thick with the smell of ozone, burnt coffee, and the metallic tang of collective panic. On the main screen, the drone feed was a grainy nightmare of muzzle flashes and dying heat signatures. "General, please," Elena Vance said. Her voice was terrifyingly steady amidst the screaming radio operators. She did not look at him. Her fingers flew across her unauthorized laptop console, bypassing the encryption of the compromised comms network. "The canyon walls interfere with the SAT comm. I have a hardline relay from the old Soviet grid. I can guide them out." "You are a filing clerk!" Sterling roared, stepping over the command table, his face purple with a father's terrified rage. "You are cluttering the only frequency we have left. My men are dying in there." "I know the terrain, sir. There is a cave system at grid 3-4, Charlie." "Silence!" Sterling's hand moved faster than thought. The sound of the slap was louder than the static on the radio. It was a wet, sharp crack that silenced the entire room. Elena's head snapped to the side. A thin line of blood trickled from her lip. The force of the blow tore the top button of her uniform, sending a pair of tarnished, taped-together dog tags skittering across the concrete floor. They landed at Sterling's boots with a heavy, distinct clatter that sounded like judgment. 48 hours earlier. Forward operating base. Viper, Hindu Kush region. The heat in the Hindu Kush did not just burn, it oppressed. It was a physical weight, a thick blanket of dust and dry air that settled into the lungs and refused to leave. Sergeant Elena Vance sat in the corner of the mess hall, her posture so still she might have been part of the furniture. She stared at the black slurry in her plastic cup, watching a single ripple distort the reflection of the overhead fluorescent light. Around her, the forward operating base, Viper, was waking up. A cacophony of clattering trays, heavy boots, and the aggressive posturing of men preparing for violence. "Hey, Mouse, you going to drink that, or just baptize it?" Elena didn't flinch. She knew the voice. Corporal Davis, a door kicker from Bravo platoon, with too much muscle and not enough patience. She slowly looked up, her expression neutral, her eyes dark and unreadable behind standard-issue wire-rimmed glasses. "It's all yours, Corporal," she said softly, sliding the tray toward him. Her voice was barely a whisper, designed not to carry, not to offend. Davis laughed, a sharp, barking sound that drew the attention of his table. "See? Told you. Scared of her own shadow. How does someone like that even get deployed to a fob like this?" "Admin error," another soldier sneered, packing a lip of chewing tobacco. "Paper pushers need to feel like warriors too, right?" Elena stood up, smoothing the wrinkles of her camouflage uniform. It was slightly too big for her frame, hiding the lean, corded muscle that lay beneath. She picked up her empty tray, moving with a deliberate, fluid grace that went unnoticed by the men laughing at her expense. They saw a small, quiet woman who filed reports and organized supply requisitions. They did not see the way her eyes automatically swept the room, cataloging the exits, the weapon conditions, and the structural integrity of the blast walls. They saw a clerk. They didn't see the ghost. She walked to the disposal bin, the laughter fading into the background hum of the bass. It had been 5 years since she had worn a different patch, since she had been Captain Vance. 5 years since the ambush that had turned her blood to ice and her heart to stone. She had chosen this life, the invisibility, the mockery, because it was the only penance that felt sufficient. "Sergeant Vance!" The sharp call came from the entrance. Elena turned. It was the base commander's adjutant, looking flustered. "General Sterling is arriving in 10 minutes. The JOC needs the updated weather reports for the sector. Why aren't they on the server?" "The server is down for maintenance, Lieutenant," Elena replied, her tone perfectly deferential. "I have the hard copies in my office. I was just retrieving them." "Well run, Sergeant. General Sterling eats people for breakfast, and he's in a mood. His SEALs are prepping for a high-value hit tonight, and everything needs to be perfect." General Kalen Sterling. The name sent a cold spike through Elena's chest, sharp and familiar. She knew the reputation: a war hero, a legend in the special warfare community, and a man known for his volatile temper and fierce protection of his men. She also knew him as the father of the boy whose blood had once soaked her hands, the boy whose dog tags now rested heavy and cold against her skin, hidden beneath 2 layers of fabric. "I'm moving, sir," Elena said. She pushed through the double doors, stepping out into the blinding glare of the mid-morning sun. The air smelled of diesel and burning trash. In the distance, the heavy thrum of rotors signaled the approach of the General's Blackhawk. Elena paused for a fraction of a second, her hand instinctively going to her chest, pressing against the hidden metal tags. A storm was coming. Not just the dust storm brewing over the mountains to the north, but a storm of memory and reckoning. She lowered her head, assumed the posture of the invisible soldier, and walked toward the command center, right into the path of the man she had been avoiding for half a decade. The Joint Operations Center, or JOC, hummed with a low-frequency vibration that felt less like machinery and more like nervous energy trapped in a concrete box. The air conditioning was cranked high to protect the banks of servers and communication arrays, chilling the sweat on the necks of the 20 men gathered around the central strategy table. Sergeant Elena Vance slipped through the side door, clutching a folder of weather printouts against her chest. She moved with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years learning how not to be seen. The room was bathed in the artificial twilight of blue monitor glow and the harsh white cone of light projected onto the topographical map in the center of the room. General Kalen Sterling stood at the head of the table, his presence dominating the space. He was a man carved from granite, his face lined by decades of command decisions, his eyes hard and bright. He used a laser pointer to trace a jagged line through the holographic projection of the valley. "Insertion at 0200 hours via halo jump." Sterling's voice was a gravelly baritone that demanded absolute attention. "Team Alpha moves to this ridge. We establish a kill box here, at the choke point. Intelligence confirms the target moves through this sector before dawn. We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we extract before their QRF even wakes up." The officers around the table nodded in unison. To them, it was a sound tactical plan. To Elena, who had paused near a stack of radio equipment to deposit her report, it looked like a tomb. She stared at the map. The holographic lines were sterile, clean representations of a messy, brutal reality. She knew that ridge. She knew the specific mineral composition of the rock walls in that sector. High iron content, jagged, interfering. "Sir," a major interrupted, noticing Elena. "The weather reports." Sterling stopped mid-sentence. He looked at Elena, his brow furrowing as if he were looking at a stain on a pristine uniform. "Just leave it, Sergeant. You're interrupting the flow." Elena placed the folder on the designated desk. Her hands were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She should walk away. That was the rule she had set for herself. Survive, serve, stay silent. But as she turned, she looked back at the red line of the kill box. It sat directly in the shadow of the canyon's western wall. "The comms won't work there," she said. The words were out before she could stop them. The silence that followed was instantaneous and suffocating. Every head in the room turned toward the small woman standing by the door. Sterling lowered his laser pointer slowly. "Excuse me?" Elena swallowed hard, her throat dry. She couldn't back down now. The ghost of her past training wouldn't let her. "Grid 47. That section of the canyon. It's a natural Faraday cage due to the iron deposits. If Team Alpha engages there, they won't have SAT comm. They'll be fighting blind." A ripple of scoffing laughter moved through the room. One of the SEAL team leaders, a bearded man leaning against the wall, smirked. "I didn't know the filing clerks were teaching advanced terrain analysis these days." Sterling walked around the table, closing the distance between them. He did not look amused. He looked insulted. He towered over her, radiating a dangerous heat. "Sergeant Vance," he said, reading the name on her uniform tape with deliberate slowness. "Do you see the stars on my collar?" "Yes, General." "And do you see any on yours?" "No, General." "Then I suggest you let the men who actually pull triggers worry about the terrain. Our equipment is state-of-the-art. It punches through anything. Your experience with whatever copier machine you operate is not relevant here." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "Get out of my JOC, and if you speak out of turn again, I will have you scrubbing latrines until your discharge papers process." Elena met his gaze for a fleeting second. She saw the absolute conviction in his eyes, the arrogance that came from a lifetime of winning. He truly believed technology would overcome geography. "Yes, General," she whispered. She turned and exited the room, the heavy steel door sealing shut behind her with a definitive clang. As she stood in the bright, dusty corridor, she could still hear the muffled voice of Sterling continuing his briefing, outlining the path that would lead his son's memory and his living men into a silent slaughter. Night fell over forward operating base Viper like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. The relentless heat of the day had dissipated only slightly, replaced by a dry chill that seeped through the thin walls of the administrative prefabs. While the rest of the base slept or prepared for the midnight operation, Sergeant Elena Vance sat alone in her cramped office, bathed in the pale, sickly glow of her computer monitor. The screen blinked a harsh red message. "Access denied. Clearance level 5 required." Elena stared at the prompt, her reflection ghostly in the glass. She saw the tired eyes of a filing clerk, but behind them, the mind of a tactician was racing. General Sterling's dismissal played on a loop in her head, mixed with the arrogant laughter of the SEALs. They were relying on the standard atmospheric model, a predictive algorithm that worked 90% of the time. But in the Hindu Kush, amidst the magnetic anomalies of the iron-rich canyons, the 90% didn't matter. It was the 10% that killed you. She needed to see the raw satellite telemetry, not the sanitized reports Sterling had glanced at. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. For 5 years, she had been disciplined. She had been mundane. To break protocol now was to risk the anonymity she had carefully constructed. If it flagged her terminal, she would be court-martialed before sunrise. "Let them die," a dark, exhausted part of her whispered. "It's not your war anymore." Elena's hand moved involuntarily to her chest, pressing against the fabric of her uniform. The edges of the dog tags beneath dug into her skin. She closed her eyes and saw Michael's face, not the bloodied ruin he was at the end, but the eager, bright-eyed lieutenant who had trusted her implicitly. He had died because someone, somewhere, had ignored the small details. She opened her eyes. The indecision vanished. Elena's fingers began to move. It wasn't the frantic typing of a Hollywood hacker. It was the precise, rhythmic entry of a pianist playing a familiar concerto. She didn't try to break the firewall. She walked around it. She accessed the legacy maintenance port of the network, a back door left open for field updates on the old comms systems used by Black Ops units that officially didn't exist, using codes that had been scrubbed from the active registry but never deleted from the kernel. Command line, sudo ghost override, a youth, Zulu Tango 9. The cursor blinked once, twice. Then the red warning dissolved into a stream of cascading green data. Access granted. Elena exhaled, a breath she felt she had been holding for hours. She quickly pulled up the real-time thermal imaging from the KH-11 satellite passing overhead. The data rendered slowly, layer by layer. What she saw made her blood run cold. The valley wasn't just a blind spot. It was a cauldron. The thermal map showed a massive pocket of cold air trapped under a layer of rising heat, a thermal inversion. The standard forecast had missed it because the canyon walls were shielding the wind sensors. To the automated system, it looked calm. To Elena's trained eye, it looked like a bomb waiting to go off. A dust storm wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. It would blind the drones, ground the extract birds, and scatter the radio waves into useless static. She checked the timestamp on the data and cross-referenced it with the mission log. Mission status: Oscar Mike. O2 Uncle to Suko. The timestamp on the screen read 2:15 Honquag. They were already gone. General Sterling had launched the birds 15 minutes ago. Team Alpha was currently hurtling through the dark sky, dropping toward a landing zone that was about to turn into a blinding, deafening hellscape. Elena sat back in her creaking chair, the silence of the office pressing in on her ears. She was the only person in the world who knew what was coming, and she was trapped in a box, stripped of her rank, her voice, and her weapon. The cursor on the screen pulsed steadily, indifferent to the catastrophe it predicted. Elena reached for the phone on her desk, her hand trembling slightly. She knew the chain of command. She knew calling the JOC now, after being thrown out, would likely result in immediate arrest. She picked up the receiver anyway. General Kalen Sterling stood with his arms crossed behind his back, a statue of command positioned perfectly at the center of the Joint Operations Center. The room was bathed in the cool blue luminescence of 20 high-definition monitors, a stark contrast to the chaotic, dirty reality being projected onto the main screen. "Status!" Sterling barked, his eyes never leaving the central feed. "Team Alpha is Oscar Mike, sir," the battle captain replied from his station. "They have passed the insertion point and are moving toward the target compound. Drone coverage is holding, but we are seeing some grain in the feed." On the massive screen, the thermal imagery showed 12 white-hot figures moving in a tactical column through the gray wash of the valley floor. To the untrained eye, they were just blobs of light. To Sterling, they were precision instruments. He watched them move with a father's anxiety buried deep beneath a general's discipline. "Clean up that image, Lieutenant," Sterling ordered, pointing at a flickering section of the canyon wall. "I want to see if there are spotters on that ridge." "I'm trying, sir," a technician replied, typing furiously. "We're getting unexpected atmospheric interference. It's thick. The signal-to-noise ratio is dropping." Sterling's jaw tightened. He remembered the quiet sergeant he had thrown out of the room earlier. Her warning about the iron deposits and the signal lag echoed in his mind for a fraction of a second before he crushed it. She was a clerk. She filed papers. She didn't understand the capabilities of the MQ-9 Reaper drone hovering at 20,000 feet. "It's just ground clutter," Sterling said, dismissing the concern. "Push through it." On the screen, the lead element of the SEAL team paused. The white figure raised a hand, the universal signal to halt. "Actual, this is Alpha 1, the team leader's voice crackled over the speakers. It was distorted, sounding like he was speaking through a layer of gravel. "Visibility is dropping fast down here. The wind is picking up. We have near-zero lux conditions." "Copy, Alpha 1, Sterling said into his headset. "Proceed to objective. Drone has you covered." But the drone didn't have them covered. As Sterling watched, the gray wash of the valley floor began to swirl. The thermal image fractured, pixelating into blocks of meaningless digital noise. The clutter wasn't static. It was a wall of dust, rising up to swallow the valley just as the forecast had failed to predict. Suddenly, the monotonous hum of the JOC was shattered. "Contact! Contact front!" The voice on the radio screamed, stripping away all military decorum. On the main screen, the pixelated gray was instantly punctuated by bright, blossoming flashes of white light. Muzzle flashes, hundreds of them. They weren't coming from a single point. They were lighting up the entire ridgeline like a Christmas tree. "Ambush!" the battle captain yelled. "We have troops in contact. Multiple heat signatures converging on Alpha's position." Sterling leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the console until his knuckles turned white. "Get air support on the line. I want that ridge sanitized." "Negative, sir," the air liaison officer shouted back, pressing his headset to his ear. "The Reaper's sensors are blinded by the dust. They can't get a lock without risking friendly fire." On the screen, chaos reigned. The orderly column of white figures had scattered. Sterling watched in horror as a thin, bright streak, the unmistakable thermal signature of a rocket-propelled grenade, trailed across the screen. It impacted the center of the formation. A massive bloom of white light engulfed the lead element. The speakers erupted with the sound of an explosion, followed immediately by a high-pitched, deafening squeal of feedback. Then silence. The main screen flickered once, twice, and cut to black. The words, "No signal," floated mockingly in the center of the void. The room froze. The only sound was the hum of the cooling fans and the frantic breathing of the staff. Sterling stared at the black screen, the reflection of his own shocked face staring back at him. The confidence of the last 48 hours evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread. They were blind. They were deaf. And his men were alone in the dark. The silence that had fallen over the Joint Operations Center lasted only a heartbeat before it was replaced by a cacophony of controlled panic. The no signal message on the main screen was a tombstone epitaph written in digital font, and every officer in the room was scrambling to erase it. "Get me a sit rep, now!" Sterling's voice cut through the noise, loud enough to rattle the glass partitions of the elevated command deck. "I'm trying to raise them on the primary SAT comm, sir, but there's nothing but static," the comms officer shouted, pressing his headset so hard against his ear as his knuckles turned white. "It's a wall of noise. The storm has scrambled the encryption keys." Sterling paced the length of the command table, his boots striking the floor with heavy, rhythmic thuds. He felt the familiar cold constriction in his chest, the sensation of losing control. The battlefield, once a chessboard he could view from the heavens, had vanished. His men were no longer icons on a screen. They were flesh and blood, fighting for their lives in a box of darkness he couldn't see into. "Switch to emergency frequencies," Sterling ordered, "and get the air boss on the line. I want CAS overhead yesterday." "Sir," the air liaison officer replied, his face pale as he looked up from his console. "The B-1B is on station, but they can't see the ground. The targeting pods are useless in this dust. If they drop, they're guessing. Danger close is in effect." Sterling swore under his breath. "Then launch the QRF. Get the helos in the air. If we can't bomb them out, we'll pull them out." The door to the JOC burst open, not with the arrival of good news, but with the physical manifestation of the problem. A gust of wind howled through the corridor, carrying with it the gritty taste of sand that coated the back of everyone's throat. The commander of the aviation regiment stepped in, pulling off his flight goggles. He looked like a man who had just wrestled a ghost. "We're grounded, General," the pilot said flatly. Sterling stopped pacing. He turned slowly to face the pilot. "Repeat that." "The storm front hit the base 2 minutes ago. Wind shear is 40 knots and climbing. Visibility is 0-0. If I put a bird up now, it crashes before it clears the perimeter fence. We are grounded until this passes." "My men are dying in that valley," Sterling said, his voice dangerously low. "I know, sir. But I can't kill a flight crew to save them. Not in this soup." The room seemed to shrink. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and the sour, acrid scent of men sweating through their uniforms. Sterling looked back at the black screen. For the first time in years, he felt the paralyzing grip of helplessness. It was the same feeling he had 5 years ago, standing in a hospital hallway, waiting for news about Michael that would never come. He was a 4-star general, commander of the most lethal fighting force on the planet, and he was utterly impotent against the physics of a sandstorm. The radio static on the speakers surged, a harsh, mocking hiss. Somewhere in that white noise were the screams of his soldiers. "There has to be another way," Sterling muttered to himself, his hands gripping the edge of the table until the metal bit into his palms. "Think, damn it. Think." "Sir?" The voice didn't come from his staff. It came from the shadows near the entrance. Sterling turned, his eyes narrowing. Standing just inside the blast doors was Sergeant Elena Vance. She wasn't wearing her usual oversized blouse. She had stripped down to her undershirt, her arms streaked with grease from the motor pool. In her hand, she didn't hold a file or a coffee tray. She held a heavy, brick-like object, a bulky, outdated ANPRC 117F radio that looked like it belonged in a museum exhibit rather than a modern command center. She stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on his. She didn't look like a clerk anymore. She looked like an operator waiting for the green light. Elena moved into the room not with the hesitation of a subordinate, but with the momentum of a breaching charge. The heavy ANPRC 117F radio weighed down her arm, but she swung it up onto the primary communications console with a dull, heavy thud that cracked the plastic casing of a keyboard. "Patch this into the auxiliary port," Elena ordered. Her voice was no longer the whisper of the filing clerk. It was flat, hard, and commanded compliance. The communications major, a man named Henderson, who had spent the last 10 minutes sweating through his uniform in panic, blinked at her in confusion. He looked from the battered green radio to the small woman standing over him. "Sergeant Vance?" Henderson sputtered, his face flushing with a mix of confusion and indignation. "What the hell do you think you are doing? Get that junk off my console." "Your SAT comm is dead, Major," Elena said. her hands already moving to unscrew the coaxial inputs on the main board. UHF and VHF are line of sight. They can't punch through the iron in those canyon walls. This is high frequency. It bounces off the ionosphere. It's dirty. It's old. But it will curve around the rock face. "Security!" Henderson yelled, shoving Elena's hands away from the jack. "I have a rogue NCO in the JOC. Get her out of here." Across the room, General Sterling spun around. The veins in his neck were bulging. He didn't see a tactical solution. He saw insubordination in the middle of a massacre. "Vance!" Sterling roared. "I told you to leave. You are compromising the operation." "I am saving it," Elena shouted back, snapping her head toward the general. The entire room went deathly silent. No one shouted at Kalen Sterling. "Your men are pinned down at the bottleneck. They can't call for fire because you are listening on the wrong frequencies." A colonel, the chief of staff, stepped forward, his face twisted in anger. He was a large man, imposing, and he used his size to intimidate. He grabbed Elena by the shoulder of her undershirt, his grip bruising. "That is enough," the colonel hissed. "You are out of uniform, out of line, and out of your mind. You are looking at a court-martial, Sergeant." Elena didn't resist the grip, but she didn't stop talking. She looked past the colonel, locking eyes with the terrified radio operator sitting behind Henderson. "Triangulate the signal bounce off the western ridge. Grid 3-4, Charlie. They are taking fire from the upper shelf." "Get her out." Sterling turned back to the main screen, dismissing her existence. "Air boss, tell the B-1B to drop blindly on the ridge coordinates. We have to risk it." "No." Elena struggled against the colonel's grip. "That's a danger close drop. You'll kill them all. The echo in the canyon makes the coordinates shift south. You need to adjust fire 200 meters north." The colonel didn't wait for another word. He shoved her hard. Elena stumbled back, her boots slipping on the polished concrete floor. She crashed into a metal filing cabinet in the corner of the room, the impact knocking the wind out of her. The old radio she had brought in clattered to the floor, spinning uselessly. She gasped for air, sliding down to a sitting position. From the floor, the room looked like a nightmare of flashing red lights and shouting men. They were so focused on their high-tech screens, on their satellite uplinks and drone feeds, that they couldn't see the simple, brutal truth she was offering them. Sterling stood with his back to her, his hands braced on the table, staring at the static. "Execute the strike," he ordered, his voice hollow. "God help us." Elena wiped a smudge of grease from her cheek. She watched the red armed light flash on the weapons console. They were about to drop 500 pounds of high explosives on the exact spot where Michael Sterling had died 5 years ago, and where 12 living men were currently bleeding out. She looked at the master control panel located just 10 feet away. It was unguarded. The speakers on the wall crackled, the static momentarily parting to reveal the voice of the SEAL team leader. It was no longer the calm, professional tone of an operator. It was ragged, punctuated by the mechanical stutter of automatic fire and the wet, desperate gasps of dying men. "Actual, this is Alpha 1. We are Winchester on primary. I repeat, Winchester. We have leakers inside the perimeter. They are swarming us." The transmission cut out with a sound that chilled the blood of every man in the JOC. The scream of a man being dragged away. General Sterling stood paralyzed. His face was gray, drained of all color. He looked at the weapons officer, his eyes dead. He knew the protocol. He knew what happened to SEALs who were taken alive in this valley. The videos would be online in days. The torture would last for weeks. "I will not let them be taken," Sterling whispered. Then louder, his voice cracking with the weight of the order. "Declare Broken Arrow. Authorize the B-1B to sanitize the grid. Danger close. Wipe it clean." The room seemed to tilt. A Broken Arrow call in this context meant calling down airstrikes on their own position. It was a mercy killing disguised as tactical support. "Sir." The weapons officer hesitated, his hand hovering over the confirmation key. "That will kill everyone on the ground, including Alpha." "Do it!" Sterling roared, slamming his fist onto the table. "Do it before they take them!" From her position on the floor, Elena felt the vibration of Sterling's shout in her bones. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the weapons officer's finger descending toward the red "Execute" button. She saw the ghost of Michael Sterling reaching out from the dust of her memory, begging to be abandoned again. Not this time. The transition from the floor to the console wasn't a decision. It was a reflex honed by years of Black Ops survival training. Elena didn't stand up. She launched herself. She moved with a terrifying speed that belied her small frame. Before the colonel who had shoved her could react, Elena had crossed the 10 feet of space separating her from the main communications hub. The radio operator, a young sergeant named Miller, never saw her coming. Elena grabbed the back of his tactical vest and yanked him backward with a precise, violent jerk. Miller flew out of his chair, crashing into the row of servers behind him. "Security!" someone screamed. Elena didn't hear them. Her world had narrowed down to the master headset lying on the console and the override switch for the UHF uplink. She slammed her hand down on the switch, cutting the weapons officer's link to the bomber, and jammed the headset jack into the command port. The click of the connection sounded like a gunshot in the chaotic room. She grabbed the microphone, her knuckles white. When she spoke, the tremble in her hands did not reach her voice. The filing clerk was gone. In her place stood the captain of Black Tusk. "Bone 1-1, this is Ghost Rider Actual, override authorization. Zulu 9, abort run. I repeat, abort, abort." Her voice boomed through the JOC speakers and simultaneously into the cockpit of the B-1B bomber circling at 30,000 feet. It was a voice of absolute authority, cold and sharp as a scalpel. "Ghost Rider?" The pilot's voice came back, confused but halting. "Command, confirm abort. We are seconds from release." "Confirm abort," Elena shouted, her eyes locked on the digital timer counting down on the screen. "Your coordinates are drifting south due to canyon harmonics. You are targeting friendly positions. Pull up now." A heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder. It was Sterling. He didn't just grab her. He seized her with the force of a man watching his authority and his son's memory being desecrated by a madwoman. "Give me that headset!" Sterling snarled, ripping the microphone from her hand. The wire snapped, sparking against the console. Elena spun around, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fire that matched the general's own. She stood her ground, trapped between the console and the man who wanted to destroy her, while the fate of 12 men hung in the silence of the severed connection. The snapped wire of the headset dangled from General Sterling's hand like a severed nerve. For a moment, the only sound in the Joint Operations Center was the heavy, ragged breathing of two people standing on opposite sides of an invisible chasm. A 4-star general pushed to the brink of insanity by grief, and a sergeant standing on the ruins of her career. "You just killed them," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying quietness that was far worse than his shouting. "I gave you a direct order. You countermanded a command decision in a combat zone. That is not just insubordination, Sergeant. That is treason." Elena did not flinch. The adrenaline of the moment held her upright, masking the terror that was beginning to claw at her throat. She looked at the man who was technically her superior, but in this moment, just a grieving father blinded by panic. "I saved them from you," Elena said, her voice steady despite the blood rushing in her ears. She gestured to the silent screens. The bomber would have missed. The coordinates were wrong. "I know the terrain, General. I know the echo." "You know nothing." Sterling threw the broken headset onto the console. The plastic shattered. "You are a filing clerk. You organize paper. You do not make life and death decisions for my seals." "Sir, please," Elena pleaded, stepping forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture. She had to reach him. She had to make him listen before the window of opportunity closed forever. "The canyon walls interfere with the SAT comm. I have a hardline relay from the old Soviet grid. I can guide them out. There is a cave system at grid 3-4 Charlie." "Silence!" The word exploded from Sterling's chest. He stepped over the command table, closing the distance between them in a single, aggressive stride. His face was purple, the veins in his neck distended. He wasn't seeing Elena Vance. He was seeing every failure, every bureaucratic hurdle, every piece of bad luck that had ever cost him a soldier. "I will not listen to another word from a delusional—" "Listen to me!" Elena screamed back, breaking the final taboo of rank. Sterling's hand moved faster than thought. It was a reaction born of pure, unadulterated stress, a physical rejection of the reality she was forcing upon him. The sound of the slap was a wet, sharp crack that seemed to suck the air out of the room. It was violent, ugly, and echoed off the concrete walls. Elena's head snapped violently to the side. The force of the blow lifted her feet slightly off the floor, sending her crashing down hard onto the polished concrete. Her glasses skittered away, one lens cracking. A thin line of blood immediately welled up at the corner of her lip, stark red against her pale skin. But it was the other sound that froze the room. As Elena fell, the top button of her uniform blouse, already strained from the scuffle, popped off. From beneath the fabric, a pair of metal dog tags, taped together with black electrical tape to silence them, swung out on a long, beaded chain. The force of the fall snapped the clasp. The tags flew through the air, catching the blue light of the monitors before landing at General Sterling's boots. Clink. Clatter. They didn't sound like standard issue tags. They were heavier, duller. They sounded like history. Elena lay on the floor, dazed, the taste of copper filling her mouth. She didn't reach for her face. She didn't reach for her glasses. Her hand shot out instinctively toward the tags, a desperate, protective motion. "Don't," she wheezed, her voice breaking. Sterling stood over her, his hand still raised, trembling now. He looked at his palm, then down at the woman he had just struck. His eyes tracked the movement of her hand, and then settled on the metal ovals lying between his boots. The silence in the JOC was absolute. The war on the screens, the static on the radios, the hum of the servers, everything faded into the background. There was only the general, the sergeant, and the secret lying on the floor between them. The ventilation system of the Joint Operations Center roared like a jet engine in the silence. But to General Kalen Sterling, the world had gone completely quiet. His hand, still stinging from the impact of the slap, hung limp at his side. His gaze was fixed on the floor, anchored to the small, tarnished metal ovals that had skittered to a stop against the toe of his combat boot. They were not the shiny, pristine dog tags of a fresh recruit. They were battered, the edges worn smooth by constant friction against skin. They were wrapped in black electrical tape, a sniper's trick to keep them silent, but the tape had peeled back with age, revealing the dull gray steel underneath. And there was something else on them, dark, rusted stain that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. Dried blood. Sterling felt a coldness spread from his chest to his fingertips. He knew those tags. He had seen the duplicates in a velvet box on his mantelpiece every day for 5 years. But the originals, the ones his son was wearing when he died, had never been returned through official channels. The report said they were lost in the field, recovered by the unknown asset who had retrieved the body. Slowly, fighting the stiffness in his own joints, Sterling crouched down. The movement was rigid, unnatural for a man of his bearing. The staff officers around him watched in bewildered paralysis, unsure if they should intervene or look away. Sterling reached out. His fingers brushed the cold metal. He picked them up, the beaded chain pooling in his calloused palm like liquid mercury. Elena lay on the floor a few feet away, propping herself up on one elbow. She didn't try to take them back. She just watched him with eyes that held no anger, only a profound, exhausted sadness. She wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of red on her pale skin that mirrored the stain on the metal. Sterling brought the tags closer to his face. The fluorescent light caught the indented letters. Sterling, Michael J. L.T., U.S. Navy. OPOS, no preference. The air left Sterling's lungs in a rush. The room spun. The name punched through his defenses harder than any bullet ever could. Memories assaulted him. Michael's graduation, the pride in his eyes, and then the funeral where the casket had been closed because the recovery had been difficult. He remembered the classified report he had read 1,000 times. Subject recovered by solo operator, call sign Ghost. Subject carried 20 miles through hostile terrain. Operator refused identification, refused reward, vanished after extract. He had spent years looking for the ghost. He had imagined a giant of a man, a fellow SEAL, a warrior of mythic proportions. He had wanted to shake that man's hand, to give him everything he owned. He looked down at the woman on the floor, the filing clerk, the nuisance, the woman he had just struck in a fit of arrogance. He saw the scars on her neck now, revealed by the torn collar, burn marks, old and faded. He saw the way she held herself, even in pain, protecting her vital organs. He realized with a sickening lurch that the ghost hadn't vanished. She had been hiding in his shadow, filing his reports, pouring his coffee, enduring his disdain, all while carrying the weight of his son's death around her neck. "It was you," Sterling whispered. The voice didn't sound like his own. It was broken, stripped of all rank and armor. "You brought him home." Elena didn't speak. She simply nodded, a barely perceptible motion. The strength that had held Kalen Sterling upright for 3 decades of war evaporated. His knees hit the concrete floor with a heavy, jarring thud. He didn't care about the optics. He didn't care about the 20 officers watching. The general was gone. Only the father remained. He clutched the dog tags to his forehead, his shoulders shaking. A sound escaped him. A ragged, choked sob that shattered the professional veneer of the command center. He was on his knees, not in prayer, but in absolute, crushing shame, bowing before the quiet soldier he had failed to see. The silence in the Joint Operations Center was heavy, filled with the ghost of a revelation that had brought a 4-star general to his knees. But war does not pause for grief, and the silence was broken not by an apology, but by the relentless crackle of the radio speakers. Actual. Taking heavy fire. We are losing containment. Where is that air support? The desperate voice of the Alpha team leader cut through the emotional paralysis of the room like a serrated knife. General Sterling remained on the floor, his head bowed over the dog tags, his breathing ragged. The shock had severed his connection to the tactical reality. He was lost in the past. Elena Vance did not have the luxury of getting lost. She pushed herself up from the floor. Her lip was swollen, throbbing in time with her heartbeat, and her uniform was disheveled, but her movement was sharp. She didn't look at the general. She didn't look at the officers who were staring at her with a mixture of awe and fear. She looked at the map. "Get the Fire Direction Center on the line," Elena said. Her voice was rasping but steady. The communications officer, Henderson, hesitated. He looked from the small, bleeding woman to the general kneeling on the concrete. The chain of command had been shattered, and without orders, the military machine ground to a halt. "I said, get FDC on the line," Elena barked, slamming her hand onto the console. "Battery 2 is in range. The Paladins can reach the valley floor." "General?" The chief of staff looked down at Sterling, uncertain. "Sir?" Sterling slowly raised his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, haunted. But as he looked at Elena, really looked at her for the first time, the fog began to clear. He saw the way she stood over the map, the way her mind was already calculating trajectories. He saw the soldier who had carried his son. He saw the only hope his living men had left. Sterling didn't stand up. He didn't have the strength yet. But he spoke, his voice low and vibrating with an intensity that terrified his staff more than his shouting ever had. "Do it," Sterling said. "Do exactly as she says. If she asks for the moon, you give it to her." The hesitation vanished. Henderson scrambled to patch the line. "FDC is online, Sergeant." "Ma'am," Henderson stammered, handing her a new headset. Elena snatched it, pressing the earpiece against her head to drown out the room. She closed her eyes for a split second, visualizing the valley. She didn't need the satellite feed. She had the terrain burned into her memory from 5 years ago, every rock, every shadow, every echo. "Fire mission, fire mission." Elena spoke into the mic, her voice dropping an octave, becoming the cold, precise instrument of war she had tried to leave behind. "Call sign, Ghost Rider, grid 34 Charlie, subsector 7. There was a pause on the other end. The call sign Ghost Rider was a legend, a ghost story among the artillery crews, belonging to a unit that didn't exist. "Target description, infantry in the open," Elena continued, ignoring the silence on the line. "Danger close. I repeat, danger close. Friendly troops are within 100 meters. Ghost Rider, this is FDC. Danger close requires General Officer Authorization initials." Elena looked down at Sterling. The general was watching her, clutching the dog tags. He nodded once, a solemn vow. "Authorization is Sterling actual," Elena said flatly. "Fire for effect. Continuous suppression. Walk the rounds north-northwest. Create a rolling curtain." "Copy, Ghost Rider. Shot out." Seconds later, a low, thumping vibration was felt through the floor of the JOC as the 155mm howitzers, positioned miles away, unleashed their fury. Elena opened her eyes and looked at the black screen where the drone feed had failed. "Alpha 1, this is Ghost Rider." she said, broadcasting to the trapped team. Steel Rain is inbound. Keep your heads down and move on my mark. I am walking you out of there. Through the static, a confused but hopeful voice replied, Ghost Rider, who is this? Someone who knows the way, Elena whispered. Wait for the thunder. On the digital map, blue tracking icons representing the artillery shells arced across the screen, descending toward the red zone of the valley. Elena watched them fall, her hand unconsciously rising to touch the spot on her chest where the dog tags used to be, feeling the phantom weight of the burden she had finally shared. The floor of the Joint Operations Center vibrated rhythmically, a distant tremor caused by the relentless impact of 100 M55mm shells pulverizing the valley floor miles away. Inside the room, the air was thick with a tension that had shifted from panic to a focused, razor-sharp intensity. General Sterling had finally stood up. He leaned heavily against the command table, his face a mask of exhaustion and awe, watching the woman he had dismissed as a nuisance command the battlefield with the precision of a maestro. Elena sat at the main console, her eyes closed. She didn't need the screens. The map was in her head, etched into her neurons by trauma and survival. She could see the dark, twisting tunnels of the canyon caves as clearly as if she were walking them again. Alpha One? This is Ghost Rider, Elena said into the headset, her voice calm amidst the static. The artillery curtain is shifting north. You have a 90-second window. Move to the cave entrance at your 3 o'clock. Do not hesitate. Ghost Rider, this is Alpha One. The team leader's voice came back, strained and breathless. We, see the entrance, but it looks like a dead end. We have wounded. If we go in there and it's blocked, we're boxed in. It is not a dead end, Elena replied instantly. It narrows for 50 meters, then opens into a limestone cavern. It's the old smuggler's route. Go. There was a pause, a hesitation. Trust is the most expensive currency in war, and Elena was asking for a fortune from men who didn't know her name. Actual, Alpha One called out, bypassing Elena to address Sterling. Can you confirm this intel? Who is guiding us? Sterling leaned toward the microphone on the console, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. He saw the swelling on her cheek, the blood on her lip, and the absolute, unshakable certainty in her posture. Alpha One, Sterling said, his voice rough with emotion. You are listening to the only person who has ever walked out of that valley alive. You trust her with your life, just as I should have. The endorsement from the general ended the debate. Copy actual, moving into the tunnel, going dark. The audio feed shifted from the roar of wind and explosions to the hollow, echoing acoustics of a cave. Elena kept her eyes closed, visualizing their steps. She counted the seconds in her head, matching their pace to the terrain she remembered. Alpha One, hold, Elena commanded suddenly. Holding, the whisper came back. What is it? You are approaching a split in the path, Elena said. To your right, there is a rock formation that looks like a howling wolf's head. Do you see it? Visual on the wolf's head. Affirmative. Do not go right, Elena said, a tremor of old fear passing through her voice before she suppressed it. The right path is rigged. Soviet-era pressure plates. They never cleared them. I left a marker there 5 years ago. A pile of stones with a red fabric strip. Checking. A tense silence stretched for 10 seconds, feeling like 10 hours. Then, a sharp intake of breath over the radio. Holy hell. I see the marker, and I see the plates. We were 2 steps away. A collective exhale swept through the JOC. The skepticism in the room evaporated completely. She wasn't guessing. She was remembering. "Take the left fork," Elena continued, her confidence surging. "It's tight, but it leads to the upper ridge behind the enemy positions. You will come out at the extraction point." For the next 20 minutes, Elena talked them through the darkness. She warned them of slippery shale, of low ceilings, of blind drops. She was with them in the dark, her voice the tether pulling them back from the abyss. She was no longer Sergeant Vance, the quiet clerk. She was the ghost, reclaiming her legend. "Ghost Rider, this is Alpha 1, the radio crackled finally, the sound of wind returning to the background. "We see starlight. We are out. I repeat, we are out on the ridge. LZ is clear." Elena slumped back in her chair, the adrenaline draining away to leave a bone-deep weariness. She opened her eyes. The no-signal message on the main screen had been replaced by a grainy but stable drone feed, showing 12 heat signatures emerging onto the plateau, battered but alive. "Good copy, Alpha 1, Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "Welcome home." She took off the headset and placed it gently on the console. Her hands were shaking now. She felt a presence beside her and looked up to see General Sterling standing there. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at her, with a look of profound humility that no one in the room had ever seen on his face before. The extraction was clinical. On the main screen, the infrared feed showed the heavy lift helicopters descending onto the plateau like giant predatory birds, their rotors kicking up clouds of dust that no longer posed a threat. The 12 members of Alpha Team boarded the birds, their heat signatures merging with the machines. When the pilot reported, "Feet wet, heading home," the Joint Operations Center should have erupted in cheers. It didn't. Instead, a suffocating silence descended, heavier and more oppressive than the one that had preceded the ambush. The adrenaline that had fueled the room for the last hour evaporated, leaving behind a cold, stark reality. Every officer, every radio operator, every analyst slowly turned away from the screens. Their eyes drifted to the center of the room, to the small woman sitting at the command console. Elena Vance sat motionless. The headset lay on the desk in front of her. She stared at her hands, which were resting on her knees to stop them from trembling. The adrenaline dump was hitting her hard, bringing with it the sharp, throbbing pain in her cheek and the deep ache in her ribs where she had hit the filing cabinet. She felt the weight of their gazes. It was a physical pressure. She hated it. She had spent 5 years perfecting the art of being invisible, and now she was the brightest object in the room. "Sergeant," a voice broke the silence. It was the Chief of Medical Staff, a commander who had rushed in minutes earlier. He stepped forward tentatively, reaching out a hand. "Let me look at that lip. You might have a concussion." Elena flinched. The movement was small but sharp. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. She stepped back, putting distance between herself and the officer. "I am fine, sir," she said. Her voice was hoarse, stripped of the command authority she had wielded moments ago, returning to the flat, deferential tone of the filing clerk. "It is just a cut." She reached up and buttoned her blouse. The top button was missing, torn off by the violence of the general's assault. She pulled the fabric tight, trying to cover the exposed skin of her neck, trying to hide the scars and the place where the dog tags used to rest. General Sterling watched her. He was still standing where she had left him. In his right hand, he clenched the dog tags so tightly that the edges bit into his palm, drawing blood that mixed with the rust on the metal. He looked at his hand, the same hand that had struck her. He felt a wave of nausea so potent he almost swayed. He had struck a subordinate. He had struck a woman. He had struck the soldier who had carried his dead son 20 miles through hell. "Elena," Sterling said. It was the first time he had used her first name. It sounded foreign in his mouth, clumsy and inadequate. "Sergeant Vance, please, you need medical attention. I need to—" He trailed off. What did he need to do? Apologize? Beg for forgiveness? There were no words in the military lexicon for the magnitude of his error. Elena looked at him. One lens of her glasses was cracked, fracturing the reflection of the room. Her left cheek was already darkening, a bruise blossoming purple against the pale skin. But her eyes were dry. There was no accusation in them, no anger, just a profound, weary desire to be gone. "The mission is complete, General," she said softly. "Team Alpha is safe. The logs will need to be updated." "Forget the logs," Sterling whispered. "Permission to be dismissed, sir?" She stood at attention. It was a perfect, rigid position of parade rest discipline, a stark contrast to the chaotic, emotional wreck of a man standing before her. Sterling opened his mouth to order her to stay, to tell her that she was a hero, that he would fix this. But he saw the plea in her eyes. She didn't want a speech. She didn't want an audience. She wanted the dignity of retreat. He swallowed the lump in his throat. He straightened his spine, trying to salvage some shred of decorum for her sake. "Permission granted, Sergeant," he choked out. Elena nodded once. She didn't salute. She wasn't an officer, and in this room she was technically an intruder. She turned on her heel and walked toward the heavy steel doors. Her gait was slightly uneven, favoring her left side, but her head was high. The room parted for her. Colonels and majors stepped back, pressing themselves against the consoles to give her a wadama. As she passed, some of them looked down at their boots, unable to meet her gaze. The door hissed open and slammed shut behind her, sealing the JOC once more. Sterling stood alone in the center of his command staff. He looked down at the dog tags in his hand, then up at his reflection in the dark monitor. He saw a 4-star general, a legend, a hero, and he knew it was a lie. "Sir," the chief of staff asked quietly. "What are your orders?" Sterling's voice was like grinding stone. "Nobody speaks of what happened in this room. Not a word. Not yet." He looked at the closed door where Elena had vanished. "Muster the entire garrison on the parade deck at 0800 hours. Every soul on this base. Cooks, mechanics, pilots, infantry. Everyone. Sir, the men need rest. The operation just ended. 0800 hours, Colonel." Sterling turned, his eyes burning with a terrifying resolve. "I have a debt to pay." The moon over the Hindu Kush was a cold, indifferent eye staring down at forward operating base Viper. It cast long, sharp shadows across the rows of prefabricated housing units where the enlisted personnel slept. In Block 4, Room 12, Sergeant Elena Vance was awake. The room was a closet, barely large enough for a bunk and a locker. It smelled of antiseptic and dust. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, pressing a bag of crushed ice wrapped in a towel against her left cheek. The swelling had closed her eye halfway. In the mirror on the inside of her locker door, she looked like a brawl survivor, not a hero. There was a soft knock on the door. It wasn't the pounding of military police or the casual rap of a bunkmate. It was hesitant, Elena lowered the ice. She knew who it was. She had heard the heavy, distinctive tread of boots pacing outside for the last 5 minutes. "Enter," she said, standing up and smoothing her uniform. The door opened, and General Kalen Sterling stepped inside. He had to duck slightly to clear the frame. In the small room, his presence was overwhelming, sucking up the oxygen. He was still in his combat fatigues, dust from the day still clinging to his boots. He looked older than he had that morning. The lines around his eyes were etched deep with a grief that had finally found its outlet. "At ease, Sergeant," Sterling said quietly, closing the door behind him. Elena remained standing. "Sir?" Sterling looked around the Spartan room. No photos, no personal effects, nothing to indicate a life lived outside of the uniform. Just a stack of books on the floor and a perfectly made bed. "I pulled your file," Sterling said, breaking the silence. "Or I tried to. It's mostly black ink, redacted by the Pentagon. Clearances I didn't even know existed." He looked at her, his eyes searching. "Who are you, really?" "I am Sergeant Vance, sir. Admin clerk." "Stop it!" Sterling's voice cracked. He took a step forward, then stopped, respecting the invisible barrier between them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dog tags. They clinked softly as he placed them on the small metal desk between them. "You carried these for 5 years. You carried him. Why? Why didn't you come to me? Why did you let me chase a ghost when you were right here?" Elena looked at the tags. For the first time, her mask slipped. Her shoulders slumped, the rigid military posture dissolving into human exhaustion. "Because you needed a hero, General," she whispered. "And I wasn't a hero. I was just the one who survived. You saved him. You brought him home." "I brought you a body," Elena said, her voice hard. "I didn't bring you your son." She turned away, looking out the small window at the dark outline of the mountains. "Michael didn't die instantly, sir. It took hours. We were pinned down in a wadi, waiting for an extract that never came. He was in pain. He was scared." Sterling flinched as if he had been slapped. He gripped the edge of the desk. Elena continued, her voice trembling but relentless. "He called for you. He was 24 years old, but in the end, he was just a boy wanting his father. But he made me promise." She turned back to face Sterling, tears finally spilling from her uninjured eye. "He grabbed my hand, and he made me swear. He said, 'Don't tell him I was scared. Don't tell him I cried. Tell him I died standing up. Tell him I was brave. He needs to be proud.'" The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sterling bowed his head, his body shaking with silent sobs. The myth of the fearless warrior he had built around his son crumbled, replaced by the heartbreaking reality of a frightened boy who loved his father enough to protect him from the truth, even in death. "I hid," Elena said softly, "because if you looked in my eyes, you would have seen the truth. I kept his secret, General. That was my mission." Sterling looked up. His face was wet with tears, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the small woman with the bruised face who had borne the weight of his son's fear so he wouldn't have to. "You are the bravest soldier I have ever known," Sterling whispered. "No, sir." Elena shook her head, picking up the ice pack again. "I'm just a clerk who knows how to keep a file closed." At 0800 hours, the sun over the Hindu Kush was already a white-hot disk burning a hole in the pale sky. The parade deck of forward operating base Viper was a sea of camouflage, Every soul on the roster was present: mechanics, cooks, pilots, and the hardened operators of the SEAL teams standing in loose, arrogant clusters near the front. The air was thick with dust and speculation. The rumors had spread through the barracks like wildfire overnight. The quiet admin clerk, Sergeant Vance, had snapped. She had assaulted a radio operator, screamed at the general, and nearly caused a friendly fire incident. Most expected a public court-martial, a grim example of what happens when discipline breaks down. "She's toast," Corporal Davis whispered to the man beside him, shifting his weight in the heat. "I heard Sterling himself dragged her out of the JOC by her collar." "Atten Hut!" The command barked from the loudspeakers, snapping 2,000 spines straight. The murmuring died instantly. General Kalen Sterling ascended the wooden podium. He did not look like a man who had slept. His uniform was pressed, his stars gleaming, but his face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed. He gripped the lectern with both hands, looking out over the sea of faces, finally resting his gaze on the far right flank, where the administrative support personnel stood. "Recover," Sterling ordered. The formation relaxed into parade rest, a collective rustle of fabric. "We define ourselves by our strength," Sterling began, his voice amplified across the silent base. "We judge a soldier by their aim, their endurance, and their volume. We assume that the loudest voice in the room is the one in charge. We assume that silence is weakness." He paused, letting the wind whip the American flag behind him. The snapping of the canvas was the only sound. "Yesterday, this command failed," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a register that carried genuine pain. "I failed. We were blind to the terrain, and we were blind to the assets in our own ranks. We nearly lost 12 good men because of arrogance." A ripple of confusion moved through the SEAL platoons. This wasn't the speech they expected. "Sergeant Elena Vance," Sterling called out. "Front and center." From the back of the formation, a small figure detached itself from the block of support staff. Elena walked the long stretch of asphalt toward the podium. She moved with a slight limp. As she got closer, the sunlight revealed the dark purple bruising that covered the left side of her face, swelling her eyes shut. A quiet gasp ran through the front rows. That wasn't a combat injury. That was a mark of violence. Elena stopped 10 paces from the general and rendered a salute. Sharp, perfect, unwavering. Sterling walked down the steps of the podium to meet her on the ground level. He did not return the salute immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. He opened it, revealing a silver star, the third highest military combat decoration. But this one wasn't new. The ribbon was slightly faded, the metal possessing the patina of age. It was his own. "For gallantry in action," Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion, loud enough for the first few rows to hear clearly. "For seizing command when leadership failed, for guiding Alpha Team out of the valley of the shadow of death, and for carrying burdens that no soldier should have to carry alone." He stepped forward and pinned the medal to her chest, right above the pocket where the button was still missing. "I am sorry, Elena," he whispered, so only she could hear. Elena looked at him. Her expression didn't change. There was no smile, no tearful gratitude. She stood like a statue carved from grief. "Thank you, General," she replied, her voice void of feeling. Sterling stepped back and snapped a salute. It held for a long, agonizing second. Slowly, the officers behind him followed suit. Then the SEALs. Then the entire base, 2,000 men and women saluting the filing clerk with the black eye. Corporal Davis, who had mocked her the day before, stood at attention, his face burning with a different kind of shame. He watched the mouse stand tall under the weight of the metal, realizing he wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes in the hell she had evidently survived. "Order arms!" Sterling commanded. The hands dropped. The ceremony was over. But as the formation was dismissed and the noise of the bass returned, Elena didn't mingle. She didn't accept the handshakes or the stunned congratulations of her peers. She turned and walked straight toward the administration building, her hand clutching not the medal, but a folded piece of paper in her pocket. A transfer request she had written before the sun came up. The hero had been recognized, but the ghost was already leaving. The flight line at Forward Operating Base Viper was a chaotic symphony of logistics. Pallets of supplies were being offloaded from the gaping maw of a C-130 Hercules, while engines screamed in a deafening, high-pitched whine that vibrated deep in the chest. The heat shimmer rising from the tarmac distorted the air, making the distant mountains look like a mirage. Sergeant Elena Vance walked across the scorching concrete, a single green duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She moved with a steady, determined rhythm, her eyes fixed on the open ramp of the waiting aircraft. She had removed the silver star from her chest, placing it carefully inside her pocket, alongside her transfer papers. To anyone observing, she was just another soldier rotating out, exhausted and ready for home. "Sergeant Vance!" The shout was barely audible over the roar of the engines. Elena stopped and turned. General Sterling was jogging toward her, ignoring the frantic gestures of the jump master who was trying to clear the tarmac for departure. The general stopped a few feet away, breathless not from exertion, but from the desperate need to say something that could bridge the gap between them. "You don't have to go," Sterling said, shouting to be heard. "I can sign the papers. I can make you a tactical advisor. You could teach at the War College. You could teach us." Elena adjusted the strap of her bag. She looked at the man who had been her tormentor, her commander, and finally, her witness. The bruising on her face was a stark reminder of the cost of truth, but her expression was peaceful. "I can't teach what I know, General," Elena replied, stepping closer so she didn't have to shout. "Survival isn't a curriculum. It's just luck and stubbornness. And my luck ran out a long time ago. You're a warrior, Elena. You belong here." "No, sir." She shook her head slowly. "I was a ghost. Ghosts don't belong anywhere. We just haunt the places we can't leave. Today, I can finally leave." Sterling looked at her, searching for a way to keep her, to fix the unfixable, but he saw the resolve in her eyes. It was the same resolve that had carried a dying boy 20 miles through the mountains. Elena reached into her pocket. She didn't pull out the medal. She pulled out the dog tags, the taped-together, blood-stained metal that had been the center of gravity for both of their lives for 5 years. She reached out and took Sterling's hand, turning his palm upward. She placed the tags in his hand and closed his fingers over them. The metal was warm from her body heat. "I carried him as far as I could," Elena said, her voice soft but piercing through the engine noise. "He's yours now, Kaylin. Take him home." Sterling looked down at his fist, clutching the physical weight of his son's memory. Tears welled in his eyes, tracking through the dust on his face. He nodded, unable to speak. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for 5 years seemed to lift, transferred from her shoulders to his, but it was no longer a burden of mystery. It was a burden of love. "Thank you," he mouthed. Elena stepped back. She didn't salute. That protocol felt too small for this moment. She simply nodded, turned, and walked up the ramp of the C-130. The loadmaster hit the hydraulic switch. The massive ramp began to close, rising up to shut out the blinding Afghan sun. Through the narrowing gap, Elena looked back one last time. General Sterling stood alone on the tarmac. He snapped to attention, his back rigid, his hand rising to a crisp, perfect salute. He held it as the ramp sealed shut with a final, definitive clank. The engines roared to full power. The aircraft taxied, turned, and surged down the runway, lifting off into the haze. Sterling remained at attention long after the plane had become a speck in the sky, long after the sound had faded. He lowered his hand and opened his fist to look at the tags one more time. The ghost was gone, disappearing back into the anonymity from which she came. But the silence she left behind wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful.